The first time Princess Alara Moonwhisper saw the Alpha King, he was dying on the marble floor of her own palace, blood pooling beneath his massive frame like a dark prophecy made manifest. The arrow that had brought down the most feared conqueror in werewolf history still protruded from between his ribs, its blackened tip glistening with moonsbane poison, the only substance capable of killing an alpha of his magnitude. His warriors stood frozen in the throne room, their weapons useless against an enemy they could not fight, watching their seemingly invincible king convulse as the poison spread through his system like liquid night. Alara's father, King Aldrich of Lumaria, sat bound on his own throne, forced to witness this unexpected turn of fate, while the Omega Princess herself knelt beside the fallen conqueror, her healing hands hovering over the wound as everyone held their breath. Before we dive deeper into this moment that will change two kingdoms forever, if you're enjoying this tale of unexpected salvation and impossible connection, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more supernatural romance stories that will keep you captivated until the very end. Cale Thornridge had carved his name across the Northern Territories with blood and brutality, claiming 7 kingdoms before his 28th year, leaving behind a trail of conquered lands and broken rulers who learned too late that mercy was not a concept the Wolf King understood. His reputation preceded him like winter wind, cold and cutting. Speaking of a warrior who showed no hesitation in battle and no compassion in victory, whose silver eyes had watched countless enemies fall without ever showing a flicker of remorse. When his army had appeared on Lumaria's borders 3 days prior, the peaceful kingdom known for its healing gardens and scholarly pursuits had understood immediately that resistance would mean annihilation. King Aldrich had opened the gates without a fight, choosing survival over pride, hoping his surrender would spare his people the massacre that had befallen other kingdoms foolish enough to oppose the northern conqueror. Cale had entered Lumaria's capital city like a storm given flesh, his massive frame towering over even the largest of his warriors, his presence commanding instant submission from everyone who crossed his path as his army flooded through the streets with practiced efficiency. The takeover had been swift and systematic, with Cale's commanders securing key positions throughout the city while the Alpha King himself had marched directly to the palace with his elite guard, intending to claim the throne and formally accept King Aldrich's surrender before nightfall. No one had expected the attack, least of all Cale himself, who had grown accustomed to victory without complication, his confidence bordering on arrogance after years of unchallenged conquest. The arrow had come from somewhere high in the palace rafters, fired by an unknown assailant who had somehow infiltrated the supposedly secured building, striking the Alpha King with precision that spoke of training and intent beyond simple assassination. Moonsbane poison was rare and difficult to obtain, its creation requiring knowledge of ancient dark arts that few practitioners still possessed, and its presence here suggested conspiracy rather than opportunistic attack. Cale's own healers had rushed forward immediately, their hands glowing with healing energy as they attempted to draw out the poison. But Moonsbane was specifically designed to resist magical healing, to turn an alpha's own supernatural vitality against itself, accelerating the toxin's spread through the bloodstream with every beat of the victim's powerful heart. Within minutes, Cale had collapsed, his legendary strength failing as the poison attacked his nervous system, causing his muscles to seize and his breathing to become labored while his warriors could only watch in horror. His second-in-command, Commander Drake, had immediately ordered a lockdown of the entire palace, demanding that King Aldrich produce whoever possessed the healing knowledge to save their king or watch Lumaria burn to ash before dawn. It was then that all eyes had turned to Princess Alara, the Omega daughter, whom most had dismissed as insignificant, unaware that she carried within her bloodline a power that had not manifested fully in 3 generations. Alara had spent her 24 years studying the healing arts in Lumaria's ancient libraries, learning techniques passed down through her maternal line, the Moonwhisper family whose ancestors had once been the most powerful healers among all werewolf clans. Her Omega status had always made her seem weak in a world that valued alpha strength above all else, but those who underestimated her failed to understand that healing magic required a different kind of power, one that flowed from connection and empathy rather than dominance and force. Now, kneeling beside Kale's convulsing form, Ilara could feel the poison's dark energy pulsing through his system, could sense how it was specifically designed to exploit an alpha's aggressive healing response, turning his body's natural defenses into the very mechanism of his destruction. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on either side of the wound, not because she was afraid of the dying king, but because she knew what saving him would cost her, what ancient power she would have to awaken within herself, what irreversible bond she might create between them. Moonsbane poison could only be neutralized by lunar magic in its purest form, the kind of healing that required the healer to temporarily merge their life force with the patient's, creating a psychic connection that would allow her to guide the poison out of his system by offering her own essence as a buffer against its destructive effects. This was the forbidden technique her grandmother had warned her about. The healing method that created permanent bonds between healer and patient, links that could never be fully severed once established. If you're wondering whether Ilara will take this risk and what consequences her choice will bring, don't forget to comment below with your predictions. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next in this tale of conquest and unexpected connection. Ilara took a deep breath and made her decision, her Omega instincts screaming warnings that she deliberately ignored as she closed her eyes and let her lunar magic flow freely for the first time in her life, feeling the ancient power that had always slumbered within her suddenly surge to the surface like a tidal wave that had been waiting centuries for release. Her hands began to glow with silver light, not the pale luminescence of ordinary healing magic, but the brilliant radiance of pure lunar essence, the same power that legend said the first werewolves had received directly from the moon goddess herself. The light spread from her palms into Kale's wound, and the moment their energies connected, Ilara gasped as she was suddenly flooded with sensations that were not her own, emotions and memories that belonged to the dying Alpha whose consciousness was now partially merged with hers. She saw flashes of Kale's life in rapid succession, images that contradicted everything his reputation suggested, memories that revealed truths he himself had been blind to for years. She saw a young boy of barely 12 years old, newly orphaned when his parents were assassinated by rival clans, standing before a council of ancient alphas who promised to guide him and protect him, while secretly molding him into the weapon they needed to expand their own power and influence. She felt his confusion and grief, as these supposed mentors had systematically isolated him from anyone who might show him gentleness, convincing him that compassion was weakness and mercy was dangerous. Training him to view the world as a place of constant threat where only the strongest survived. She witnessed his first conquest at 16, how the council had manipulated intelligence reports to make him believe the neighboring kingdom was planning an attack on his territory, how they had celebrated his brutal victory while hiding the fact that the kingdom had actually been seeking peace negotiations. Memory after memory revealed the same pattern, a young alpha being carefully controlled and directed by advisors who fed him half-truths and strategic lies, using his genuine desire to protect his people as justification for endless expansion and preventative conquest. The psychic connection allowed Ilara to feel Kale's dawning horror as the poison's effect on his system somehow broke through mental barriers that had been magically reinforced for years, revealing suppressed doubts and buried questions he had never been allowed to fully examine. The moonsbane was inadvertently serving as a truth serum of sorts, its disruption of his physical systems, creating cracks in the psychological conditioning that had shaped him since childhood. Ilara could sense the war happening within his consciousness, the collision between the ruthless conqueror he had been trained to be and the leader he might have become if given different guidance. The painful recognition that much of what he had believed about himself and his campaigns had been built on manipulation and lies. She pushed deeper with her healing magic, following the poison's path through his bloodstream, using her lunar essence to neutralize the toxin molecule by molecule, while simultaneously reinforcing his failing vital systems. The process was excruciating, her own body beginning to shake from the strain of channeling so much power, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought to maintain the delicate balance between drawing out the poison and keeping his heart beating. Around them, the throne room had fallen into absolute Silence. Warriors and servants alike watching in awe as silver light pulsed between the Omega Princess and their dying king, the manifestation of magic that most present had only heard about in ancient stories. Commander Drake stood closest, his hand on his sword hilt, torn between gratitude that someone might save his king and suspicion about what price this healing might demand, or what leverage it might give Lumeria over their conquered ruler. King Aldrich watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and fear, recognizing the power she was displaying as the legendary lunar healing that his own mother had possessed, but had never taught to the next generation. Knowledge that Alara must have found somehow in the forbidden sections of the royal library. The healing continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only minutes, Alara's magic working methodically through Kale's system, neutralizing the poison while repairing the damage it had already caused to his organs and tissues. She could feel his consciousness becoming more stable, his convulsions slowing as the toxin's grip on his nervous system weakened, but she could also feel the bond between them solidifying, the psychic link that her healing technique had created becoming permanent with each passing second. Finally, the last traces of Moonsbane were purged from his system, expelled through the original wound in a black vapor that dissipated into harmless smoke upon contact with her lunar light. Alara withdrew her hands slowly, the silver glow fading from her palms as she sat back on her heels, utterly exhausted from the magical exertion, but satisfied that Kale would survive. The Alpha King's eyes opened slowly, silver irises focusing first on the ornate ceiling above him, then shifting to find the Omega Princess who knelt beside him, her face pale with fatigue, but her expression calm and resolved. For a long moment, Kale simply stared at her, his enhanced alpha senses immediately detecting the psychic bond now connecting them, feeling the echo of her presence in his mind like a gentle light in darkness, aware that she could probably sense his emotions just as clearly as he could now feel hers. The realization that this small Omega had not only saved his life, but had also seen his most private memories, had witnessed the truth about his manipulation and the guilt he had never acknowledged, left him feeling more vulnerable than any physical wound ever had. Kale pushed himself to a sitting position with visible effort, his warriors moving forward to assist, but stopping when he raised a hand to halt them, his attention remaining fixed on Alara as he processed everything that had happened. The psychic connection allowed him to sense that she harbored no intention to exploit what she had learned, no plan to use his moment of weakness against him. Only a bone-deep exhaustion and a quiet sadness for the losses his campaigns had caused, a compassion that should have been impossible for someone whose kingdom he had just conquered. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself uncertain what words could possibly address this situation, how to respond to the Omega who had every reason to let him die, but had instead risked her own life to save his, who had given him an unasked-for gift of truth alongside healing, forcing him to see clearly for the first time the puppet strings that had guided his path. Before he could formulate words, Commander Drake stepped forward, his relief at seeing his king alive overriding his usual military formality as he dropped to one knee and bowed his head in respect to both Kale and Alara, acknowledging the debt they now owed to the Lumerian princess. If this story of healing and unexpected revelation is drawing you in, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and please consider subscribing to our channel where we bring you captivating supernatural romance tales every week. The other warriors followed Drake's example, dozens of hardened soldiers kneeling in the throne room, their gesture creating a strange tableau where the conquering army bowed before the conquered, acknowledging that their king's life had been preserved by the very people they had come to subjugate. Kyle remained silent, his analytical mind working through implications and consequences, while another part of him, newly awakened or perhaps finally freed from suppression, struggled with emotions he had been trained to ignore, guilt and shame mixing with confusion and an unwelcome attraction to the Omega whose healing touch still seemed to linger on his skin. Alara slowly stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, and King Aldrich immediately rushed down from his throne to support his daughter, his bound hands making the gesture awkward, but his paternal concern overriding all protocol and danger. Kale watched the interaction, seeing the genuine love between father and daughter, remembering suddenly that he had planned to separate them, to send Aldrich to a territorial outpost while keeping Alara at the capital as insurance for Lumeria's continued cooperation, a standard practice in his conquests that now seemed needlessly cruel, given what he understood about the manipulation behind his strategies. The Alpha King rose to his feet with more confidence, his supernatural healing already working to restore his strength now that the poison was neutralized. Though he remained aware of the psychic thread connecting him to Alara, the bond that would let him sense her emotional state and general well-being regardless of physical distance. He looked at Commander Drake and made a decision that surprised everyone present, his voice rough but clear, as he ordered his second to stand down the occupation forces, to have his warriors withdraw to camps outside the city, rather than maintaining positions throughout Lumeria's capital. The command caused visible confusion among his men, who had never witnessed their king showing any form of restraint or reconsideration once a conquest was initiated. But discipline held, and they obeyed without question, filing out of the throne room with practiced efficiency. Once only his closest advisors remained, Cale turned his attention back to King Aldrich and Princess Alara, his expression unreadable as he announced that he would be remaining in Lumeria's palace as a guest, rather than a conqueror, that he required time to recover from the assassination attempt and to investigate who had orchestrated the attack using poison that should not exist outside of very specific and supposedly extinct circles. His words were diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear to everyone present. Cale was claiming Lumeria's resources and cooperation, not through force, but through the debt created by Alara's healing, binding them with obligation, rather than chains, while he processed the revelations that continued to cascade through his consciousness. Now that the mental conditioning was broken, Aldrich accepted this arrangement with cautious gratitude, understanding that it was far better than the alternative outcome, while Alara remained quiet, her empathic abilities enhanced by the bond allowing her to sense the turmoil within Cale, the collision of his carefully constructed identity with uncomfortable truths about manipulation and choice. The days that followed were strange and tense, with Kyle occupying guest quarters in the palace's east wing, while his army remained camped beyond the city walls, unusual situation that had both his own people and Lumeria's citizens uncertain about what would happen next. The Alpha King spent his mornings meeting with Commander Drake and his other officers, reviewing reports from his territories and investigating the source of the Moonsbane arrow, tracking down evidence that pointed increasingly toward conspiracy within his own council of advisors. The afternoons he devoted to recovery, his body healing rapidly from the poison's effects, but his mind requiring more time to process the psychological impact of having years of conditioning suddenly stripped away, leaving him to confront decisions and actions he could no longer justify with the rationalizations he had been fed. And the evenings, seemingly by unspoken agreement, he found himself drawn to the palace gardens where Alara tended the medicinal plants that formed the basis of Lumeria's healing traditions, their psychic bond making it impossible for either of them to completely avoid the other's presence even when they tried. Their early conversations were awkward and formal, stilted exchanges about his recovery progress and her magical exhaustion, both dancing around the deeper connection that hummed between them and the complicated history that should have made any form of relationship impossible. Alara maintained her compassion, but refused to let him forget the cost of his conquests, speaking plainly about the refugees his wars had created, the families torn apart, the cultures diminished when kingdoms were absorbed into his empire and forced to abandon their traditions in favor of standardized rule. Cale listened without defending himself, the psychic bond preventing him from dismissing her words as enemy propaganda, forcing him to sit with the discomfort of genuine accountability, as she described consequences his handlers had always downplayed or hidden from his awareness. Through their connection, Alara could feel his shame intensifying with each revelation, could sense his growing determination to find some way to address the damage done even if he could not undo it, could recognize that the ruthless conqueror was transforming into something different, someone who might actually be worthy of the power he wielded. The investigation into the assassination attempt yielded disturbing results, with evidence mounting that the attack had been orchestrated not by Lumerian resistance, but by members of Kale's own council, ancient alphas who had grown concerned that their weapon was beginning to question the necessity of constant expansion. Commander Drake uncovered communications suggesting the council had decided Kale was becoming a liability, that his growing hesitation before conquests and his questions about the intelligence justifying military action indicated he might soon refuse to follow their direction, making his elimination preferable to losing control over the empire they had built, using his strength and reputation. The Moonsbane arrow had been meant to kill him in Lumeria and create chaos that would allow the council to install a more malleable ruler, while blaming the peaceful kingdom for assassinating their conqueror, justifying complete annihilation of Lumerian culture, and using that brutality to warn other territories against resistance. The plot's exposure filled Kale with cold fury, the kind of rage that had once fueled his battlefield prowess, but now was directed inward at his own blindness. His willingness to be used, his failure to question the voices that had guided him since childhood. Don't miss what happens next in this journey of revelation and transformation. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complicated path toward redemption and unexpected love. Elara witnessed Kale's transformation through their bond, feeling his anger and self-recrimination, his determination to dismantle the power structure that had manipulated him. While simultaneously grappling with the enormity of trying to govern an empire he now recognized was built on false pretenses and others' ambitions, she found herself drawn into unexpected alliance with him, her healing knowledge and her kingdom's diplomatic traditions providing perspective he had never been offered, helping him see possibilities beyond the binary of conquest or chaos that his council had always presented. Their evening meetings in the garden became strategy sessions where they discussed governance and justice, explored ideas about voluntary confederation rather than forced subjugation, debated whether 7 conquered kingdoms could be transformed into willing allies if given reason to trust that cooperation would be honored rather than exploited. The psychic bond between them deepened with proximity and shared purpose. What had begun as a purely magical connection created by emergency healing, gradually evolving into something that resembled friendship and threatened to become more. Kale found himself fascinated by Elara's mind, the way she could hold multiple perspectives simultaneously and find solutions that honored competing needs, the strength she displayed in maintaining her principles, even when facing someone who had once terrified her entire kingdom. For her part, Elara discovered layers beneath the conqueror's reputation, recognized the intelligence that had been deliberately channeled into destruction, saw glimpses of the leader he might have been if given mentors who valued wisdom over warfare. The attraction between them was complicated by power imbalances and recent history, by the fact that Lumeria remained technically under his control even if he was no longer actively oppressing them, by the reality that an Alpha King and an Omega Princess represented exactly the kind of hierarchical pairing that reinforced problematic dynamics in werewolf society. Yet neither could deny what was growing between them, particularly when the psychic bond made concealing emotions essentially impossible, when they could feel each other's interest and desire mixing with hesitation and uncertainty. Kyle recognized that acting on his attraction would be fundamentally inappropriate given the circumstances, that even if Elara seemed willing, the imbalance of power between conqueror and conquered made true consent questionable at best. He forced himself to maintain distance despite the bond's pull, channeling his energy instead into the investigation and into planning how to address his council's betrayal while minimizing harm to the territories under his control. Elara appreciated his restraint, even as she felt the cost it demanded, could sense through their connection how much discipline it required for an alpha of his power to resist the mate bond that the psychic link was rapidly becoming, recognized that his choice to prioritize her agency over his own desires was perhaps the clearest evidence of his genuine transformation. The confrontation with the council came 6 weeks after the assassination attempt, when Kyle had gathered sufficient evidence and secured the loyalty of enough military commanders to act without triggering civil war. He summoned the council members to Lumeria under the pretense of discussing integration strategies, deliberately choosing to face them on conquered ground where their influence was weakest, and where Elara's presence could be explained as necessary for ongoing healing treatments. The 5 ancient alphas arrived expecting to lecture Kale about his unusual handling of the Lumerian occupation, perhaps to reinforce the conditioning they believed still controlled him, completely unprepared for the methodical presentation of evidence that detailed their manipulation spanning back to his childhood, their orchestration of conflicts to justify expansion, their attempt on his life when he began questioning their authority. Kale's rage was cold and controlled as he stripped away their political positions and territorial governorships, exiling them to remote regions where they would live under guard but without power, choosing mercy only because execution would make martyrs of them and potentially destabilize the territories they had administered. The council's removal created immediate political chaos throughout the empire, with various factions uncertain about who now held legitimate authority and whether Kale's sudden change in governance philosophy represented strength or weakness. The Alpha King addressed these concerns through a series of edicts that shocked his own bureaucracy, announcing that each of the 7 conquered kingdoms would be given the opportunity to negotiate new terms of association with his crown, that leaders who had been deposed would be contacted about potential restoration if their people desired it, that the empire would begin transition toward a confederation model where territories retained significant autonomy in exchange for mutual defense agreements and trade cooperation. The pronouncements were met with suspicion from those who assumed this was tactical maneuvering rather than genuine policy shift. But Kyle backed his words with concrete actions, withdrawing military governors from 3 kingdoms immediately, and inviting diplomatic delegations to his capital to discuss specifics of the proposed restructuring. Ilara watched these developments with cautious optimism, advising Kale when asked, but maintaining appropriate boundaries given the complicated dynamics of their relationship. Through their bond, she could feel his exhaustion as he worked to dismantle systems of oppression while maintaining enough stability to prevent collapse into chaos, could sense his frustration when progress came slower than hoped, could recognize his fear that the damage he had caused might be too extensive to truly repair regardless of his current efforts. She offered support without absolving him of responsibility, celebrated incremental victories while reminding him of remaining injustices, became the conscience he had been denied during his years of manipulation, while also serving as evidence that transformation was possible if someone chose to do the difficult work of change. Their relationship existed in ambiguous space, clearly more than healer and patient, but deliberately not yet romantic partners, bound by magic and growing affection, but separated by complicated ethics and the need to prove that his reforms were genuine rather than strategic performance. The turning point came 4 months into the restructuring process, when delegates from the Kingdom of Silvermere, the first territory Kale had conquered, arrived in Lumaria to negotiate their confederation terms. The delegation was led by Crown Prince Adrian, younger brother of the king Kale had killed in combat during that initial conquest, someone with every justification for hatred and vengeance, yet who approached the high negotiations with pragmatic calculation rather than emotional reactivity. Adrian made clear that Silvermere's cooperation would depend entirely on concrete guarantees and verified reforms, that words about confederation and autonomy meant nothing without mechanisms for enforcement and consequences for violation. The prince demanded specific concessions that would have been unthinkable months earlier, including the return of territories that Kale's forces had annexed, reparations for families who had lost members in the conquest, and the right for Silvermere to maintain its own military force, rather than being absorbed into the Empire's unified army. Kale accepted these terms with minimal negotiation, recognizing them as reasonable requests given the circumstances, his agreement stunning even Commander Drake, who had expected their king to push back against demands that essentially reduced his power and admitted fault. The Alpha King went further, offering a public apology to Prince Adrian and the people of Silvermere, acknowledging without qualification that the conquest had been unjust and based on manufactured intelligence about supposed threats that had never actually existed. The apology was broadcast throughout his territories, a deliberate communication to all conquered peoples that their grievances were recognized and that his governance philosophy had fundamentally changed. Some viewed this as weakness, predicting that admission of wrongdoing would embolden rebellions and destabilize the empire. But others recognized it as unprecedented courage for an Alpha King to admit error and attempt accountability rather than defending past actions through rationalization and force. If you're invested in seeing where this redemption journey leads and whether these two souls can find their way to each other despite everything that separates them, please show your support by liking and subscribing. The Silvermere Agreement became a template for subsequent negotiations, with other kingdoms approaching talks with specific demands that Kale generally accepted, understanding that genuine autonomy required giving up the control his council had taught him was essential for security. Not all territories chose to remain associated with his crown, even under the generous terms offered. 2 kingdoms opting for complete independence and receiving recognition of their sovereignty, along with formal peace treaties. Kale bore these rejections without attempting to change their decisions through intimidation or incentives, recognizing that forced association would contradict everything he claimed to have learned. His empire shrank considerably as the restructuring progressed, territory and tax revenue declining while military resources were redistributed to support Confederation members' autonomous defense forces rather than maintaining overwhelming central control. The transformation was profound and genuine, visible not just in policy changes but in how Kale carried himself. The constant tension that had characterized his presence gradually easing as he built governance structures based on cooperation rather than domination. Ilara watched this evolution through their bond and through direct observation, saw him learning to listen before deciding, to consider perspectives beyond military strategy, to value diplomatic solutions over shows of force. She felt her own feelings deepening beyond admiration for his efforts toward something that looked remarkably like love, despite all the logical reasons why such emotion was complicated and potentially unwise given their history. The attraction was mutual and increasingly difficult to ignore, their psychic bond making them acutely aware of each other's emotional states. The desire that built during their strategy sessions and garden conversations. The longing they both felt, but refused to act upon, while power imbalances remained unresolved. The situation reached a crisis point during a Confederation summit 8 months after the assassination attempt, when delegates from all associated kingdoms gathered in Lumeria to formalize the new political structure and establish governing procedures for their alliance. Kale used the occasion to announce his intention to abdicate his title as Alpha King of the Northern Empire, arguing that the Confederation required leadership untainted by conquest, and that his continued rule, however reformed, would always carry the shadow of his past actions. The declaration caused immediate uproar, with some delegates arguing that his abdication would create dangerous instability, while others insisted it was necessary for true transformation. Commander Drake stood to remind everyone that Kale's military strength had been what initially protected many territories from other predatory powers, that removing him entirely might invite new conquest attempts from neighboring regions that viewed the Confederation as weakened prey. Ilara found herself standing unexpectedly, her voice cutting through the debate, as she pointed out that the issue was not whether Kyle retained any leadership role, but whether power structures themselves needed to be reimagined beyond traditional hierarchical models. She proposed that the Confederation adopt a rotating council leadership system, where no single alpha maintained permanent authority, where decisions required consensus among representatives from member kingdoms, where the military forces remained under Confederation command rather than any individual ruler's control. Her suggestion was radical, challenging fundamental assumptions about how werewolf societies organize themselves, but it offered a path forward that acknowledged both Kale's role in creating the Confederation and the need to prevent future abuses of concentrated power. The delegates debated her proposal intensely, some alphas resisting any system that would limit their traditional authority, while others, particularly younger leaders and Omega representatives, embraced the possibility of governance that did not require submission to a single dominant figure. The compromise that eventually emerged incorporated elements of Ilara's vision, while maintaining some traditional structures for stability, creating a Confederation Council where Kale would serve as military commander, but with authority checked by civilian leadership from member kingdoms, his decisions subject to review and requiring approval for any military action beyond immediate defense. The arrangement satisfied enough factions to move forward, though it represented a dramatic reduction in Kale's power compared to his previous imperial authority. He accepted the terms without hesitation, recognizing that rebuilding trust required more than words, demanded visible structural changes that made abuse of power difficult, regardless of who held leadership positions. The summit concluded with the formal establishment of the Northern Confederation, a political entity unlike anything that had existed in werewolf history, built on principles of autonomy and cooperation rather than domination and control. That evening, after the delegates had retired and the political maneuvering had temporarily ceased, Kale found Alara in the palace gardens, where their most important conversations always seemed to occur. Through their bond, he could feel her exhaustion mixed with satisfaction, the toll of months spent helping him navigate transformation while managing her own kingdom's recovery from occupation. He approached slowly, giving her opportunity to move away if she preferred solitude, relieved when she remained seated on the stone bench, where moonlight filtered through ancient trees to illuminate her features. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the psychic connection making verbal communication almost unnecessary, both processing the day's events and their implications for the future they had been. Slowly building, Kale finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear, as he told Alara that he understood their bond had created a connection neither had chosen, that he recognized the power imbalance that still existed despite political reforms, that he would never presume to act on feelings that might be complicated by magical compulsion and recent history. He offered to commission the most skilled healers in the Confederation to research ways of severing or muting their psychic link if she desired. Separation, to give her freedom from a bond she might experience as unwanted burden rather than gift. His words were selfless, but Alara could feel through their connection the pain they cost him, the hope he was deliberately suppressing, the loneliness that had characterized most of his life and that he had only recently begun to acknowledge. Alara turned to face him fully, her expression gentle, but her voice firm as she told him that she had no desire to sever their bond, that what had begun as emergency healing had evolved into a connection she valued deeply, that his assumption about her feelings perhaps revealed his continued tendency to make decisions for others without asking what they actually wanted. She explained that her hesitation had never been about lack of attraction or affection, but about ethics and timing, about ensuring that any relationship between them was built on genuine choice rather than magical compulsion or political calculation. She acknowledged that power imbalances remained despite reforms, that an alpha's strength and a Confederation commander's authority still created dynamics that required careful navigation, but suggested that awareness of these factors was itself important, that conscious effort to maintain equality could be more meaningful than pretending imbalances did not exist. As their conversation continued deep into the night, both finally admitted feelings they had been carefully controlling for months, acknowledged the love that had grown alongside political transformation, recognized that their bond had become something they chose, rather than simply something that had happened to them. Kale asked permission before touching her, his alpha instincts held in check by hard-won discipline, his desire tempered by respect for her agency and autonomy. Alara gave her consent clearly and enthusiastically, eliminating any ambiguity as she closed the distance between them, and let herself finally express the affection she had been restraining. Their first kiss was gentle despite the intensity of feelings behind it, a meeting that acknowledged both the passion between them and the care required given their complicated history. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because this story's conclusion will show you that even the most unlikely love can flourish when people choose growth over pride and accountability over ego. The months that followed saw Kale and Alara navigating their relationship with the same careful intentionality they had brought to political restructuring, establishing boundaries and communication patterns that honored both their bond and their individual autonomy. They faced skepticism from various quarters, some viewing their romance as strategic alliance, while others questioned whether genuine equality was possible between an alpha commander and an omega princess. Kale and Alara addressed these concerns through consistent behavior rather than defensive arguments, demonstrating through daily choices that their partnership was built on mutual respect and shared values. Alara maintained her own authority within Lumeria and the broader Confederation, her healing knowledge and diplomatic skill making her an influential figure independent of her relationship with Kale. He supported her work without attempting to control or direct it, learning to step back and let her lead in areas where her expertise exceeded his, accepting that strength sometimes meant recognizing when others were better suited to particular challenges. The Confederation continued to evolve, not without setbacks and conflicts, but generally moving toward greater autonomy and cooperation among member kingdoms. Kyle's role as military commander kept him busy addressing external threats and internal disputes, but he approached these challenges with strategies that prioritized diplomatic solutions and proportional responses rather than overwhelming force. His reputation gradually shifted from feared conqueror to respected if still controversial leader, someone whose past actions were not forgotten, but whose current efforts toward accountability and reform were recognized as genuine. Alara worked alongside Confederation healers to establish medical exchanges between kingdoms, sharing knowledge and techniques that had previously been hoarded as territorial secrets, building networks of cooperation that transcended political boundaries. Their relationship deepened into true partnership, the psychic bond that had initially seemed like an imposition, becoming instead a source of strength and understanding that enhanced their individual capabilities and their collaborative efforts. 2 years after the assassination attempt that had brought them together, Kale formally proposed to Alara during another summit in Lumeria, asking her to be his mate, not as a political alliance, but as a personal choice built on love and shared commitment to continuing the work of transformation they had begun. Alara accepted his proposal with full awareness of the challenges they would continue to face, the scrutiny their relationship would endure, the responsibility of modeling a different kind of partnership for societies, still learning to value equality alongside strength. Their mating ceremony was held in Lumeria's palace gardens, where they had shared countless conversations, and where Kale had first admitted his feelings. A private ritual attended only by close family and friends who had witnessed their journey from conqueror and conquered to partners in every sense. The bond they had created through healing magic was formalized through traditional werewolf mating rites, but with modifications that emphasized mutual commitment and equal partnership rather than alpha dominance and omega submission. They exchanged vows that acknowledged past wrongs and future responsibilities, promising not perfection, but continued effort toward growth and accountability, toward building something better from the ashes of what conquest had destroyed. The years that followed brought continued challenges and ongoing work, the Confederation requiring constant attention and negotiation to maintain cohesion without resorting to the forced unity of empire. Kale and Alara led this effort together, their different strengths complementing each other, their bond allowing coordination and understanding that enhanced their effectiveness. They had children eventually, 3 pups who grew up learning that leadership meant service, and that power carried responsibility to those affected by its use. The family they built became a symbol of possibility for the Confederation, proof that transformation was achievable if people chose to do the difficult work of change, rather than accepting inherited systems and assumptions. The epilogue of their story found them 20 years after that initial meeting, when Kale had been dying on Lumeria's throne room floor, and Alara had made the choice to save him, despite every reason not to. The Confederation had grown and stabilized, becoming a model that other regions began studying and sometimes adopting, demonstrating that cooperation could be stronger than conquest when built on genuine autonomy and mutual benefit. Kale remained military commander, but now served under civilian authority that had grown increasingly confident in limiting his power when necessary, a constraint he accepted as proper, rather than resenting as limitation. Alara had become chief diplomatic coordinator for the Confederation, her healing background giving her unique perspective on conflict resolution and her omega status, once viewed as weakness, now recognized as providing different but equally valuable form of strength. They sat together in the same garden where they had shared their first real conversation, watching their youngest child play among the healing plants while discussing Confederation business with the comfortable rhythm of partners who had spent 2 decades learning each other's thoughts and supporting each other's growth. Through their bond, still strong after all these years, they could feel each other's contentment, mixed with awareness that challenges remained, that the work of building justice was never fully complete. That transformation was an ongoing process, rather than a destination achieved. Kale looked at Alara and reflected quietly on how the assassination attempt that should have killed him had instead saved his life in ways more profound than physical healing, how the Omega who should have been his conquered subject had instead become his greatest teacher and truest partner, how the kingdom he had invaded seeking to conquer had instead conquered him through compassion and offered him possibilities he had never imagined. Alara smiled at her mate, her king, her equal partner in all the ways that mattered, and responded through their bond that sometimes the greatest victories came through surrender, that true strength revealed itself in choosing growth over pride, that the most powerful magic was not healing that mended bodies, but love that transformed souls. Their story had begun with conquest and poison, but had evolved into redemption and partnership, proving that even those who had caused great harm could learn and change if willing to face uncomfortable truths and do the hard work of accountability, that love could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when people chose connection over division, that healing was possible for individuals and societies if someone was brave enough to take the first step toward transformation and strong enough to continue walking that path even when it became difficult. The Northern Confederation stood as testament to these principles, imperfect but striving, built on foundations of justice rather than domination, a legacy they hoped would outlast them and inspire future generations to imagine possibilities beyond what had always been. Thank you so much for joining us on this epic journey of conquest, healing, redemption, and love. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more supernatural romance tales that explore the transformative power of love and the courage required to change. Until next time, may you find healing in unexpected places and strength in choosing growth over comfort.